welcome everyone. We're glad to have you here. I am going to turn it over to Veronique, who is going to introduce Katie Peterson, our speaker today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Veronique Noel, the Event and Research Program Manager at SESYNC. Thank you for joining us for today's seminar. On this gorgeous spring day, at least here in Maryland, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Peterson, who is a current postdoc with SESYNC. Her background spans quantitative ecology, marine biology, and decision science. Her postdoctoral research has been focused on how interactions between species shape ecological dynamics and how this can be applied to improve conservation and sustainable management. She is also interested in the role of uncertainty in making decisions from ecological models and how this contributes to the value of information in decision science. Her SESYNC project examines the repercussions of temperature variability in multi-species fishery. Katie earned her PhD through the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University. Prior to that, she obtained a Master of Environmental Science and Management from the Bren School at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a Bachelor of Science at Louisiana State University. Next week, she will be starting a new role at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado as part of the Marine Energy team. Though she'll be switching gears from ecology, she'll continue working on decision science in socio-environmental systems to help implement renewable marine energy projects for remote communities. Fun fact, Katie has done fieldwork in a variety of ecosystems, including the Great Barrier Reef, wetlands in southeastern Louisiana, and desert grasslands of Central California. Thank you, everyone. Let's welcome Katie.
Thank you so much, Veronique. I'm so excited to give this talk today. So I'm not going to talk about my main SESYNC research project, but I wanted to highlight some work that I've been collaborating on with members of the D Lab. So Laura D at CU Boulder has been my collaborating mentor for my postdoc, and I've been able to work on a really cool side project that has built on some of my PhD work with some really fantastic early career researchers in the D Lab. So that brings me to the title of my talk. I'm going to be discussing ecological networks and structured decision-making for ecosystem management. So ecological networks are communities and species where they're interacting, and they can be comprised of interactions that are competitive or trophic interactions where a species is eating another one, or they can be positive interactions. So this is a representation of an ecosystem food web made by one of my collaborators, Lucy Van Clunen. And we can abstractify this to just represent an ecological network in a traditional network sense. And using this, we can sort of constrain it down to elements of motifs and topologies of the networks and evaluate consequences to the changes of networks based on those topologies. So many species face extinction as a consequence of habitat and environmental changes that they can't escape. And because of this, species introductions are continuing to be a very important area of research. So in a species introduction, as individuals of a population establish in an ecosystem or habitat outside of their current or endemic range. This can happen accidentally, like in ballast water discharge, where zebra mussels have been become invasive in different waterways that they're not native to. It happens naturally as species distributions expand due to changes in their habitat. So this is among more mobile species like lionfish, where they can just shift their range northward due to climate change. And this can also be mediated by humans. So species that have boundaries that affect their ability to expand their range can be translocated by humans in order to protect that species. So I'm going to focus on these human-mediated species introductions today. And examples of these run the gamut, and it's also known as assisted migration, as humans are assisting the migration of these species outside of their endemic range. One example of why this might be done is to protect the species from various threats like climate change or from predators. So Edith's checker spot butterfly is sort of the poster child for assisted migration for conservation in light of climate change. It's been known since the 90s that the southern populations of the butterfly has been extremely vulnerable to local extinction due to climate change. And its overall range has been diminished due to a suite of threats like urban and agricultural development. Its remaining intact habitat is at risk of becoming unsuitable due to warming and drying due to climate change, but it's been unable to expand its range because it can't navigate around the sprawling urban area of Los Angeles. So advocates for assisted migration have suggested that cocoons should be translocated to suitable habitat north of LA. It's also been invoked to bolster ecosystem functions or ecosystem services. So this is a burrowing bettong. It is being translocated to an island refuge in Western Australia, in part to protect it from predators on mainland Australia, but also to bolster the ecosystem function it provides of soil turnover, which creates habitat for other species on the island. And also many fish species are often translocated to other areas, either for agriculture or aquaculture or recreational fishing. And then species have often been translocated for bioremediation. So often this is phytoremediation with plants or bacteria, soil organisms, or biological control. The cane toad is an example of biological control going wrong. The cane toad was introduced to Australia to control the cane beetle that was destroying sugarcane farms. And instead of actually doing that, the cane toad, which is poisonous, has just wreaked havoc on native animals within Australia. It didn't actually affect the cane beetle because the cane toad lives in the lower part of cane fields and the cane beetle is in the higher part of sugarcane reeds. So they don't actually interact, just as an artifact of where they are located in terms of the cane reed. So assisted migration is really controversial because of examples like the cane beetle, where the intentions were good and the consequences were negative. There's also just so many examples of accidental introductions where a species just becomes invasive and destroys an environment. So ecological communities are essentially a type of network, as I mentioned. Here, each blue node represents a species, and the lines represent interactions between the species. And as I mentioned before, this can be competitive, it can be trophic. And assisted migration has been pretty well studied in terms of what happens to the species that's introduced, here represented by the green node. But what hasn't been well studied is how it affects the species that are already present, which are the blue nodes. So if we introduce a new species, do we destabilize that network and cause the species that are present to become locally extinct? The consequences are relatively unknown. There are 3 general outcomes following assisted migration. In the best outcome, a species that is translocated to serve some sort of benefit to the ecosystem becomes established and it doesn't harm any other species. and the ecosystem remains intact but slightly changed. In a failed ecosystem, the species is translocated but does not successfully establish in the new habitat. In this circumstance, it hasn't negatively affected other species to the extent that they become locally extinct. But the translocated species, if it has failed to establish in the new habitat, it is essentially a waste of resources and time and energy that could have been put towards other conservation interventions. And so then the worst outcome is when a species is translocated, it somehow impacts the recipient ecosystem where at least one species becomes locally extinct. So the research questions to sort of answer this was, given the possible outcomes, we wanted to see how often each of those occurred. And then we wanted to determine how many species were lost when things went really wrong after assisted migration. And we were also interested in how these outcomes held in different contexts. So one of those contexts was how the density of interactions within a network impacts the outcomes of assisted migration. So looking at one element of network attributes. The nodes in a network can be sensitive to network structure, especially the degree of connectance within a network. So if species are more interconnected, there's a chance that the introduction of a new species will directly or indirectly impact more species. To get an answer to those questions and gain some general insights into the effects of assisted migration, my co-author, my former PhD supervisor, and I set up an ensemble of theoretical ecosystems. Ensemble modeling is essentially running the same general model over and over thousands of times, and it lets one change the model slightly, either through small changes in the model structure or parameter values, and then compare the output. The ecosystems we simulated were comprised of 15 coexisting interacting species using Lotka-Volterra models, which is the equation shown here. It's the classic equation used to represent interacting species. So the change in abundance of species through time t depends on the intrinsic growth rate and the abundance of that species. In our models, the intrinsic growth rate for each species were randomly chosen from a uniform distribution to represent just complete uncertainty and the fact that this is a theoretical system. The interaction matrix comprised of elements X, which represent the per capita interaction strength of species J on individuals of species I. And these per capita values combined with the abundances of species J and species I gives the amount of interspecific competition from species J onto species I and the amount of intraspecific competition within species I. So intraspecific competition is when a species is competing with members of its own species. We changed the interaction matrices for each simulation by changing the degree of connectance between species and the magnitude of interactions through random parameter values. So to generate random levels of connectance, we use a Bernoulli random variable to decide if species interacted or not. And where species did not interact, there was a 0 in the interaction matrix. This let the degree of connectance randomly vary across models in the ensemble. We then used another Bernoulli random variable to decide if non-zero interactions were positive or negative, and we fixed the diagonals to always be negative to ensure density dependence from within species competition. And then we used a uniform distribution to allocate the values of the parameters. And so we ran many models to get 100 coexisting 15 species ecosystems. Any models where there weren't at least 15 species coexisting were discarded. And then we introduced a species, subjected it to one translocation in each model. And then we ran that multiple times with different parameter values within the interaction matrices. So we ended up with 10,000 models in the ensemble. So in terms of our outcomes, we got the best outcome 61% of the time. This is where the translocated species became established, but didn't negatively impact other species. Failed translocations occurred 17% of the time. And the worst outcome, where multiple species became extinct, occurred 22% of the time. So using the results from our ensemble model and a risk analysis, we calculated the average total species richness when assisted migration was not chosen and when it was. This graph shows the probability of the translocated species in green persisting in its native habitat, which was 50%. We set that to represent a critically endangered species by IUCN criteria. The persistence of this species increases to 90% when you included translocated species that successfully established in the recipient ecosystem. And this left a 10% chance that species will not persist in any outcome if assisted migration is chosen or not for the focal translocated species. And then this blue distribution is the distribution of possible numbers of species within the recipient community persisting. There are 15 species within the recipient community at about 80% of the time, which includes the best and failed outcomes where the recipient ecosystem is unaffected. When the recipient ecosystem is affected, there's a rare but still possible chance of losing multiple species within the recipient ecosystem, bringing the species richness down to about 7 species in some instances. So that's this red circle here. So if one does not proceed with assisted migration, the total species richness is 15.5. The 0.5 is a 50% chance that the would-be translocated species survives on its own, and the 15 is due to the fact that the recipient ecosystem would be unaffected. If one does proceed with assisted migration, the total richness is slightly lower, with an average of 15.4 species. In the best outcome, you have 16 total species, which includes the 15 recipient and then the translocated species. But this is offset by the instances where multiple species are lost following translocation in the worst outcomes. So as I mentioned, we also looked at another scenario where there were different densities of interactions. So instead of letting the connectants randomly vary in the ensemble, we ran ensembles where the density of interactions was fixed at 25%. And the density of interactions was fixed at 75%, as well as 50%. The overall species richness is worse in models with high or moderate densities of interactions, but not so in the lower density of interactions. So the distribution among the recipient ecosystem, there's a greater chance that you will lose more species in following translocation when the interaction network is more connected. So this brings me to some current research that I'm working on with a fantastic lab group. So as I mentioned, Laura D is my collaborating mentor for my postdoc, and she's guided some of this research. And I'm co-leading a project with Lucy Van Clunen, who's PhD candidate in the ecology department and computer science department. She is a computing and mathematical wizard, as well as Megan Hayden, who brings a lot of interesting insights on species distributions, Aislinn Keys, who's working on ecosystem services, and Dr. Erin Schwartz, who is a former postdoc in the lab group who just moved on to other work, who has a background in trade-off analysis, and cost-benefit analysis in ecological systems. So this current project that we are working on started out as a review of how you can estimate changes to ecological networks following introductions and what that means for management. And it's grown beyond that in scope to include a modeling exercise as well. So the objective for this project was to synthesize quantitative methodologies for predicting the consequences of species introductions. So we wanted to review other methods beyond the ensemble model that I used, including things like allometric trophic networks and other kind of models. And then review methodologies from decision science in the context of species introductions to sort of review different ways that practitioners can evaluate the consequences of intervening in a species introduction or not, and evaluate different objectives and what that means when there are competing objectives. So if ecosystem services are prioritized over species persistence. And then exploring the trade-offs of those consequences in a quantitative way. And then we wanted to demonstrate the utility of this framework through a theoretical case study, which is what Lucy is leading in this project. So the first step of our framework is to, we review how to identify management objectives and what this means in terms of evaluating decisions when faced with species introductions. So as a management practitioner, there are often multiple different objectives that need to be addressed to varying extents when working on a project. Some of those include conservation goals like protecting an endangered species. Some include bolstering an ecosystem service that might be important to facilitate the preservation of other species or provide some sort of service to people directly. Similar conservation goals would be maximizing biodiversity, and then also perhaps maintaining a certain abundance of a species that provides some sort of cultural or economic good. And then we review different ways of forecasting the addition of new species. When an introduction is human mediated, often it is intentional, but we also discuss ways of forecasting invasive species by looking at traits and fecundity. And we also review how using species distribution shifts due to climate change or other changes in the ecosystem can be used to anticipate how a species might be introduced to the system. And then we go into an in-depth discussion of link prediction. So by using traits of species that are extant in the ecosystem and the anticipated species that will be introduced, you can anticipate which species will interact with each other. Some of this includes like niche-based traits and other attributes of species. Phylogeny is a way to estimate which species will interact with each other, as well as observed co-occurrence in other systems or related species that are co-occurring in other systems. And then also using the relative abundance of species, you can anticipate which species are more likely to interact. So if species are higher in abundance or more common, they're more likely to interact than rare species. And then finally, we review different modeling methods to predict the consequences to food web dynamics. So an example is allometric trophic networks, which uses allometric scaling and trophic dynamics to estimate how the food web will change. Dynamic community models, which include the Lotka-Volterra model that I used in my previous work. There's also qualitative network analyses that can be used to predict changes as well. And then finally, we use different methodologies to evaluate the outcomes for management in a multi-objective context. So trade-off analysis for Pareto efficiency, cost-benefit analysis, other decision science tools like that. So in our theoretical example, we are using a well-known food web, a well-studied system where the interactions that are present are known and the attributes of the species are known. For example, one species might be, in terms of objectives, one species might be protected as it provides an ecosystem service, and another species might need to be protected because it's culturally important. So these are two different objectives that we're estimating through this theoretical framework. And then we introduce a species and use traits and niche position within the ecosystem to predict which species will interact with which. And so in our example, this introduced species is being introduced for the sake of conservation, but the anticipated interactions with species are unknown. The interaction strengths are uncertain, and so those are pulled from a distribution and evaluated at different strengths. And then using this in an allometric trophic network methodology, we can predict the outcomes of what will change within the ecosystem. So after the species is introduced, it might cause one species to become locally extinct, which will have ramifications throughout the food web, where abundances of other species either increase or decrease. And this might affect the ability of some species to be providers of an ecosystem service, and it might affect conservation objectives like protecting a species due to its cultural importance. And we're looking at different scenarios. So among one of the scenarios we're looking at is different network structures and different levels of connectance. And then there are two species with different trophic positions that are being introduced. And one scenario that we're considering is looking at species that are introduced having other attributes other than different trophic positions. And then also looking at ecosystem services that are associated with different species, either one species and different levels within the trophic network, or multiple species associated with one ecosystem service. So an example result would be a trade-off analysis looking at two conservation objectives. So one conservation objective would be preserving that culturally important species, and then the other would be increasing the abundance or preventing the extinction of the species that's introduced. And there are multiple different outcomes from different intervention options, including the translocation itself and other interventions. And these outcomes differ so much due to the uncertainty in interactions within the ecosystem network. But depending on what you would prioritize, certain outcomes and intervention options might be more important. So if you care more about preserving the species that you're introducing to the species, then you might choose one of the light green options because it's more likely that that will be the ideal efficient outcome for that. Although there's still some uncertainty that it might not turn out that way. And similarly, you can conduct a trade-off analysis comparing the persistence of a species and the utility of an ecosystem service following intervention after a species translocation as well. So essentially, this work is looking at how network structure and interactions can result in different outcomes that might not be anticipated prior to introducing a species. And anytime an intervention is conducted, there's a risk and a reward trade-off. So if you're introducing a species, is it worth it to introduce it at the risk of damaging the ecosystem and harming extant species? That might depend on the threatened status of species within the ecosystem. It would depend on if the endemic species within the ecosystem are confined to that particular location. If there are other populations, maybe it's okay for their abundances to change. And then impacting the population sizes without extinction also has certain consequences as well. A species may not go extinct, but its abundance might be decreased such that its role within the ecosystem becomes virtually non-existent. And all of these combine to affect ecosystem function and services, and depending on what objectives a management practitioner might be prioritizing, these changes to ecosystem function and services might not be worth introducing a species. So by using this framework, there's a structured way to evaluate this risk-reward trade-off. And the theoretical work that I spoke about earlier is from my PhD, and that was published in Conservation Biology. And the work that is in progress in this structured decision-making context is currently in progress and should be submitted soon. So I just wanted to acknowledge a few people that I've been able to work with. My postdoc supervisor, Laura D, she's been a fantastic mentor, and I'm so lucky to have worked with her. My colleagues within the D Lab, the PhD students and fellow postdocs have been amazing, and they've become really good friends. And I'm super thankful for SESYNC for this fellowship, being able to attend workshops and just the community it's provided. Jess Hopf is a former colleague of mine in my PhD, and she now runs a graphic design consulting service, and she made a lot of the lovely graphics that are used in this current research that I'm involved in. And then Mike Bode was my PhD supervisor and my co-author on that previous work. And I also want to acknowledge the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the land in Boulder, Colorado, which is where I am today. So thank you.